Are you familiar with the phrase, beware the Ides of March? You may have heard this phrase that is said in Julius Caesar, the play by Shakespeare, and this phrase is said as a warning to Julius Caesar to avoid going into the public sphere, into the Senate, on or around March 15th, 44 BC. This warning was spoken to Julius Caesar, who disregarded the warning and then ended up, as we know, assassinated. This warning was spoken by an Etruscan oracle. An Etruscan soothsayer named Spurina is credited with this phrase. And in fact, did you know that in the ancient world, the Etruscans were known as the mystical people, the oracles, the soothsayers, those who brought prophecy? So who were these mysterious, mystical Etruscans? Stay tuned to find out more. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. This saying, beware the Ides of March, is used as a general synonym for a bad omen. And what does this term Ides refer to? This comes from Latin, but scholars believe originally came from the Etruscan spoken language to mean about the middle of the month. So in the case of Julius Caesar, March 15th, 44 BCE, also known as the day he got stabbed in the back. Et tu, Brute. So, who were the Etruscans? Let me read you this wonderful quote by D.H. Lawrence from Etruscan Places from 1929. The Etruscans, as everyone knows, were the people who occupied the middle of Italy in early Roman days, and whom the Romans, in their usual neighborly fashion, wiped out entirely. But is this true? Were the Etruscans really wiped out? No. The probably more accurate way to say this is that the Etruscans were absorbed into and became Roman. As soon as the Romans overtook the Etruscans, everyone who was living in Etruria sort of woke up one day and they were part of the Roman Empire, to put it loosely, let's say. So where is Etruria? What are we talking about when we say this term Etruria? Etruria is the ancient name for the Italian peninsula, and we're talking roughly about central and parts of northern Italy. So roughly from around Tuscany, Emilia-Romagna area down to just south of Rome. So this central area of Italy is Etruria, and this is where the Etruscans lived. They were contemporaries of the ancient Greeks and eventually the ancient Romans, and they were taken over, as you have heard, by the Romans. The Etruscans lived at the same time as the ancient Greeks, and we know this because we actually have textual sources written by ancient Greek writers who wrote about and told other Greeks about the ancient Etruscans. We might think of the Etruscans as sort of the native Italians. I mean, this is a very complex word, but they're sort of a mix of perhaps indigenous local Italians and other people who migrated to the peninsula from the east. They're not really related to the Romans, only that they are absorbed into Rome once the Romans take over. Now, what we know about the Etruscans, we know mainly from the archaeological record. We have mainly artifacts and images that were found in their tombs. This is partially because this is what archaeologists have found, and these are the kinds of archaeological sites we can visit today. In fact, you can visit the Etruscan tombs just outside of Rome even today. But very little residential architecture has been excavated. That doesn't mean none, but there is very little. And part of this is because as I've mentioned, they were absorbed into Rome. And so many of these structures and their sort of ways of life were subsumed by Roman traditions. The study of Etruscan art has sort of been lost to history and ignored by many art historians up until the 19th century. So in the grand scheme of Western art history, the study of the Etruscans and of Etruscan art is a relatively new topic in art history. For example, artists of the Renaissance were not really concerned with, nor did they even really know much about Etruscan art. But since the 1800s, and especially in the last 50 to 100 years, archaeologists and art historians have learned so much more about the ancient Etruscans. So let's get to know them a little bit. Now, despite the fact that they're sort of an understudied ancient culture, the Etruscans did have a strong impact on ancient Roman art, and we are fortunate that so much is being found and that this field is growing. It's kind of an exciting time to be an archaeologist or an art historian studying the Etruscans. So what do we know about Etruscan culture? Well, we know that they are characterized by the Greeks as being somewhat a superstitious people. In fact, they're famous for their oracles and seers. And as I mentioned earlier, an Etruscan oracle is credited with the phrase, "Beware the Ides of March." We also know by looking at their art and especially looking at their tombs that they valued the afterlife. They may have had some knowledge of Egyptian beliefs in the afterlife. We also know from looking at their art that they were very skilled metal workers and that their metal objects were sought out amongst ancient cultures. We also know that they are known in the ancient world for their winemaking, and some scholars believe that they actually taught the French how to make wine. I know, this is controversial, but I learned to love Italian wine before French wine, so I don't know if you want to say to a French person that the Etruscans taught the French how to make wine. They are also known as great traders and seafarers, and in fact, they rivaled Rome and the Carthaginians in terms of trade. They did trade with the Greeks, and they're known for trading wine and these metalwork objects throughout the ancient world. However, despite being great seafarers and great traders and great artists, they never really unified into one political structure. They were sort of more like independent city-states, and this perhaps weakened their central power and made them susceptible to being overtaken by the ancient Romans. In the ancient world, the Etruscans are also known not just for their winemaking, but also for their wine parties. And if you know anything about ancient Greece, you know that they also had wine parties. But ancient Greek wine parties were frequented by the men of ancient Greece, the upper class men of ancient Greece, and then sex workers. Their wives were not allowed to attend these parties. But in ancient Etruria, and this was very shocking to the ancient Greek writers who wrote about this, Etruscan women were permitted to attend these famous wine parties where drinking, dancing, and revelry reigned. In fact, Etruscan culture is known for their parties and their celebrations. They're known for music, dance, poetry, and athleticism. And this is really coming from the imagery that we see painted on the walls of Etruscan tombs, where we see dancers, musicians, and athletes performing wrestling, perhaps even a prototype to the ancient Roman gladiatorial games. We know that the Etruscans did have writing because they did use the Greek alphabet to write in the Etruscan language, but most of the written documents that we have are really short, sort of like giving the name to an individual, especially on objects. So there are some objects that have names on them of like sort of who does this object belong to. But we do not have their literature, their poetry, or their music written down. Likely these were passed on through oral tradition. And what was the role of women in Etruscan culture? Earlier, I mentioned that women were allowed to attend the wine parties, which was very shocking to the ancient Greeks. We know that the women of Etruscan society had some level of status that was not enjoyed by other women of the ancient world. For example, when a child was born, they are given both the name of the father and the mother. Both of these names are recorded, so this means that matriarchal lineage also holds importance. We also know that women could own property independent of their husbands. And if you want to know more about women in ancient Etruscan culture, stay tuned to the next video in the series where I will talk about women in ancient Etruria. Despite being enigmatic and considered a sort of mysterious lost culture, they actually had a great influence on the ancient Romans and, of course, on Italy today. In fact, the Etruscans founded the cities of Florence, Pisa, and Siena. They're also responsible for spreading literacy throughout the peninsula, and their art and cultural beliefs influenced Roman culture. In fact, if you think of the ancient Romans and you think of the Colosseum and gladiatorial combat, some scholars argue that the Etruscans were actually the originators of gladiatorial combat. And in fact, we see this in Etruscan tombs that depict funerary games and specifically wrestling. We also see that Etruscan architecture influenced Roman temple architecture. So, contrary to popular belief, Roman architecture is not an exact carbon copy of ancient Greek architecture. They're definitely inspired by ancient Greek temples, but we also see some influence of Etruscan temple architecture on Roman temples. The Etruscans are also known as the oracles of the Roman Empire. Hundreds of years after the Etruscans had been conquered by the Romans and absorbed into the empire, the Romans still maintained an Etruscan priesthood in Rome, which they thought necessary to consult when under attack from invading barbarians. What kind of art are the Etruscans known for? So earlier I mentioned metalworking. Here is a great example of some Etruscan metalwork. This is a fibula, and a fibula, I'm not talking about the bone, I'm talking about this art historical term. A fibula is basically a kind of brooch or a pin that was used by the ancient Greeks, the Etruscans, and the Romans to fasten their garments. And they came in a variety of shapes, and they're sort of based on the concept of a modern safety pin. So here we're looking at a fibula that was found in the Ceveteri cemetery, dated to about 650 BCE to 640 BCE. And this is made of gold. This is about 1 foot and 1/2 an inch high, and it's currently held in the Vatican museums in Rome. So this was found in the tomb of a wealthy Etruscan family, and as you can see, the Etruscans really knew how to work gold very well. This might have been inspired by some objects that had been imported into Etruria, but their skills in metalworking were really far superior to what could have been imported at the time. So, for example, let's look very closely at this. In the top register, you see a depiction of some lions. You may remember from ancient Mesopotamia, of course, lion imagery is associated with rulership and leadership. Zooming in and looking closely, in this central register, you can see these horizontal bands, and they are covered with this granulation that makes a really interesting texture, almost reminds us of chainmail. And this is called granulation. This is a fusing of tiny metal balls or granules onto this metal surface. This is a really difficult metalworking technique. So their skills were unsurpassed in the ancient world at the time. And in fact, the Etruscans are really known for their jewelry. So if you are within a reasonable distance to the Getty Villa in Los Angeles, up in Malibu in California, I highly recommend you visit the Getty Villa, because this is where you can see a room full of Etruscan artifacts, and especially Etruscan jewelry. Rings, earrings, necklaces. Their jewelry is absolutely spectacular. And I'm not even that into jewelry, but If I could get my hands on some Etruscan inspired jewelry, I'd be rocking that stuff. What else are the Etruscans known for? They're also known for their architecture, even though we don't really have any of their temples. Their temples did not survive because they were eventually replaced with Roman temples. When we look at Etruscan and Greek temple architecture next to each other, we can see some big differences. First of all, Greek temples are built of limestone and marble. Sometimes they had terracotta or wooden roofs, but otherwise they're built of really sturdy material. Instead, Etruscan temples are built of sun-dried mud brick walls, wooden columns, and roofs, and their foundations were made of stone. So really what survives of the Etruscan temples are their foundations. But when we look at Etruscan and Greek temples side by side, we can see some similarities. We see triangular pediment, we see columns in front of the facade. So in some ways, Etruscan temples emulated Greek designs. However, there are some differences. Greek temples are longer, Etruscan temples are shorter and sort of more frontal. In fact, they have a completely fully enclosed building and they only have columns on the front side, whereas Greek temples have columns going all around, making them more light and airy. So there's this frontality to Etruscan temples, and this is something that the ancient Romans picked up from the Etruscans. Here we can see the Roman temple of Portinus is influenced by this frontality of Etruscan temple architecture. But perhaps what the Etruscans are really most well known for is not their jewelry or their temple architecture, but their tombs. And this is in part because this is what has been passed down. This is what has survived the centuries. Probably the most well-known Etruscan art are the Etruscan sarcophagi. Remember, a sarcophagus is just a fancy word for a coffin. Here we're looking at the sarcophagus with reclining couple from the Cerveteri cemetery. Most of the sarcophagi that have been found in Etruscan tombs have been terracotta. So imagine, this is huge. This is life size. Imagine terracotta this large. First of all, it's very difficult and complicated to make something this large out of terracotta. Some in stone have survived, but most of them are terracotta, and they would have originally been painted, so they would have looked really different than they look today. If you want to know more about the Etruscan sarcophagi, stay tuned for the next video in which I will specifically discuss the role of women in ancient Etruscan society, and we will look at the Etruscan sarcophagi to understand this better. Perhaps what the Etruscans are most well known for are their interiors of their tombs, and specifically the wall paintings on the interiors of their tombs. What do we see depicted on the interior walls of the tombs? Here we're looking at the interior of the tomb of leopards. This is in Tarquinia, Italy. These are dated to about 480 to 470 BCE, and these are massive underground rock-cut tombs that you can visit today. It's just a few hours outside of Rome. You look at this vast field, and out there, out in the outskirts of the countryside of Rome, if you go into these tombs, you go downstairs and you can enter into and look at the interiors of these tombs. The walls of these tombs are covered with fresco paintings. Here we're looking at a wall from the Tomb of the Leopards, and you can see in this top register right under the ceiling are these two leopards facing each other, and underneath this we see men and women lounging on beds, feasting at a banquet. So they're eating and drinking. We see servers carrying pitchers of wine and cups, bringing these to serve the wine to the people that are lounging. We also see musicians playing flutes. We see dancers. We see people generally engaging in festivities, a party. We don't really see mythological scenes. We don't see, gods and goddesses like we might see in ancient Greek art. Instead, these are scenes of perhaps the lives of the deceased, or maybe this is what the Etruscans thought heaven looked like. The tone is joyful and celebratory, not a solemn contemplation of death, but instead a celebration of life, and specifically of the good things in Etruscan life, of music, dance, poetry, good food, good wine, and great company. We also see in Etruscan wall paintings from these tombs depictions of people diving into the sea, fishing. We see some depictions of Etruscan boats. And again, remember, they're known for their maritime prowess. And we see here a depiction of the funerary games that involve wrestling. So perhaps this is the prototype or the origin of the later Roman gladiatorial games. In addition to the fabulous jewelry, their wall paintings from their tombs, their terracotta sarcophagi, we will also see great skill and talent in Etruscan metalworking in terms of large scale sculpture. So here we're looking at the Etruscan chimera of Arezzo. What's a chimera? This is a fire-breathing, mythological hybrid creature that has a lion's body, one goat head sort of growing out of the torso, and a snake for a tail. This is a votive piece. It was presented probably as an offering to a deity, maybe Zeus. They perhaps worshiped the same deities as the ancient Greeks. And this is known because of an inscription that's cast on the front right leg of the lion. Probably the most well-known bronze sculpture that is attributed to the Etruscans is the Capitoline wolf. Here we see a depiction of the she-wolf that, according to legend, nursed Romulus and Remus after they were abandoned as infants. These are the twins who, when they grew to adulthood, quarreled. Romulus killed his brother Remus, and on April 21st, 753 BCE, Romulus himself founded Rome and became the city's first Roman king. There were Etruscan kings in Rome, but once Romulus came along, this new Rome was founded. This sculpture that we're looking at here, there is actually some debate whether or not this is Etruscan. We know for sure that Romulus and Remus, these two children who are suckling at this she-wolf, these were definitely added later, and some scholars think that the entire sculpture itself is not even Etruscan at all. However, this is still up for debate. Many scholars still attribute this to the ancient Etruscans. The statue of the Capitoline wolf, the she-wolf, seems to have been made for the new Roman Republic after the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus, and it became the sort of totem or symbol of the new government. It's an appropriately defiant image, and it has remained the emblem of Rome to this day. So, even though people may have never heard of the Etruscans, if you go to Rome today, you will see this image everywhere. In fact, you can even see this image throughout former Etruria. In fact, recently I was in Siena and I saw this Capitoline wolf image depicted on the top of a column in the center of the medieval town of Siena. So what do you think? Are you kind of into the Etruscans now? If you had never heard of them, stay tuned for the next two videos in which we will look at women in ancient Etruria and we will delve deeper into the tombs of the Etruscan elite. As always, if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to Art Trippin. Comment below if you have any questions or let us know what you want to hear more about. As always, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and stay tuned for more Art Trippin.